So please join me in welcoming Katie Barrowman.
Thank you, Tracy. Can everyone hear me okay? We're good? Okay. All right, let's see if this works. Okay. Well, I won't reiterate my bio, as Tracy did a great job introducing me, but I did want to share a little bit of how I ended up working in water. Are there any lawyers in the room by any chance? Maybe? Yes? Okay. This picture, this is my father. This was the day I decided to not be a lawyer. And just to preface this, my brother's an attorney here. He does some work in Wapaka as well. And the reason why, I was out in Lake Michigan, and we were fishing, which I've done since I was 6. My dad was in the Coast Guard, grew up on the eastern shore of Virginia. And we were out, and we ended up catching a brown trout. And when we pulled it out of the water, I looked at it, and it did not look good. We knew well enough that one was going back for sure. But we started talking about, this is what's going on in our Great Lakes. We hear it every time we go out there. We're talking with other folks that fish. And it's something that's not just happening in the Great Lakes, but across the world. And so at that moment, I thought, I wonder if I could do something about this. And at the time, I took my LSAT, was ready to go to Marquette Law. And then I realized that maybe there was another path for me. Maybe I should explore, instead of just going to law school just like my brother did, what would be another path for me? And so I did some research, and I landed on a program that was brand new at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee called Sustainable Peace Building. And so you can imagine when I told my parents I was going to get my master's in peace building, they said, "You've got to be joking, right? What are you going to do for a job?" And I, after meeting with the consultants at the university, ended up getting a scholarship, and I just told my parents, I said, 5 years from now, my job doesn't exist yet. Right? This is a new way of thinking about the world, a new skill set that would need to come eventually down the road. And when you're talking about water issues, it's one of those, and I'll get to this in my presentation, but it's a crisis that's nice because it gives policymakers such a long lead time to actually do something about it. But that's also the danger of it, right? Is that there's so many years that go by without anything happening. And so if you hadn't had a chance, and I'll touch on this later in the presentation, but there are free books back there of a book that I was a research assistant on, focused on that. And it was published in 2019. We're in 2024. Nothing's changed. Nothing. And so, as Tracy suggested in my background, I've touched a little bit of everything in water, but I decided for this presentation I was just going to give these three focuses. Basically, just a primer about background on water. I'm sure you guys know quite a bit, but I was just going to go over a few things. Talk about water stress. Water doesn't get enough attention in the news, and so I'll go into whether or not we are actually stressed. And then what I always like, and a philosophy I learned from my boss, I don't like just talking about the problems, because it's very easy to be doom and gloom, and I think that's why no one does anything, because there's no solutions out there. And so I'm going to spend a good amount of time talking about what can we do to improve the situation with our water in the US in particular. We were talking a little bit at dinner about travel. This is a photo I took when I did a trip with National Geographic up to the Arctic. I was lucky enough to see quite a few polar bears. But I think that it's a really good indication of, misunderstanding of what's going on. I think the photo of the year this year was a polar bear on an iceberg. And so it's a good reminder of this, right? I always tell my nieces, they take a look at what the Earth looks like, right? And what's the first color you see when you're looking at a satellite image of the Earth? It's blue, right? But what we don't also know is that only 3% is actually fresh water. And of that 3%, 2.5% is frozen, or for right now it is at least. And so that leaves us for, 0.5% of total Earth's water that we're actually able to use for fresh water. As you guys probably know, two sources of fresh water. We've got the surface water and we have aquifers. I know this seems like high school science, but it's always nice to have a refresher of just what kind of water sources we're actually looking at. And my favorite water source, of course, is the Great Lakes or Holmes. And some fun fact is that it actually accounts for 21% of the world's fresh water. And so we'll get to this in a second. So 21% of the world's fresh water. Do we think that we're water stressed? And so just think about that for a second. Okay, so of that water source, of the freshwater sources, I want you to imagine a pie graph. And I know I kind of like buried the lead there, but when you ask a person who's just an average citizen, they would imagine that most of our fresh water goes to us, right? So things like drinking, eating, washing our clothes, taking a shower. Because when we talk about water conservation, we're talking about the things that we can own and we can do. So in our households, turn the faucet off while you're brushing your teeth or take a shorter shower. If we're gonna actually move the needle, we have to address the real water source, right? So 70% is in agriculture. Okay, so how is this possible? 70% of the water, I mean, that's an extreme amount. And so when you think of like, how do we grow our vegetables or things like that, how could that possibly end up totaling the full 70%? This is why. Because we're not just talking about lettuce in a salad, we're not just talking about peaches on a tree, we're talking about what's called a water footprint. So how much water does it actually take to make a product that we see? So when I look at a pizza, or like when my husband and I have dinner, that's usually our choices. He's a little bit of a picky eater, he's a meat and potatoes kind of guy. And so you look at how much water it takes to make a 12-ounce steak. Similarly, a pizza with no meat, still 12,000 liters. And then you can see going down that a glass of milk, 255 liters for one glass of milk. Orange, and the difference between one orange, 80 liters for a single orange. And then you look at your chocolate bar, which is my favorite nighttime snack. 1,700 liters. Anybody wearing blue jeans? Okay. 11,000 liters of water for one blue jean. Or t-shirts, lots of t-shirts, 2,700 liters for one cotton t-shirt. We could talk about, I'm sure you guys all have cell phones, 13,000 liters for one cell phone. And so I like to play this game at dinner parties where I say, do you know how much water it takes to make that, X, Y, and Z, which my friends love, my husband in particular. And they always say, well, why does it matter? We're how far away from the Great Lakes? We don't have any issues, right? Wrong. So this has to be one of I usually lead my presentations with this because it's startling. So most of the work I do right now is in the Colorado River Basin, so you're looking at, let's see if I can get my pointer to work. So right down in here, right? Because it's completely red. But I think what shocks everybody, we're not green, we're not even opaque, we're orange in Wisconsin. I think we're listed, what do I have on here? 17th in water stress in the US. So when I talk about water stress, there's two levers that I like to talk about. One is drought. So how much water do we actually have coming into our system? And then when you look at this is from 2023. This was one of the worst years, and I think we all know this just from anecdotes on the news. I don't know if any of you are actually farmers, but it was one of those situations where they were talking about having disaster relief, and obviously they have crop insurance and things like that. But it was devastating in this area, and it was because they weren't getting enough rain. And so what's happening is, even in a place like Wisconsin, where I think we have about 500,000 irrigated acres, more and more of those acres that are being rain-fed are now gonna have to be irrigated. Which brings me to lever number 2 in water stress. So the areas that are feeling drought, farmers then go in and say, well, I need to irrigate my crops some way. They're not getting enough rainwater, so they pull from aquifers. And so you already have water that's being drowned down, or levels that aren't achieving the levels they normally would because of a reduction in precipitation. But you amplify that when you start withdrawing aquifers in an area that is already experiencing that not significant thing of recharge. Recharge is the word that they use. So this is another scary map. This looks like at agricultural production. And so when you're looking at water stress, and now all of a sudden Wisconsin is bright red, straight through the central stands. You look at places like Florida. I was just talking about this project. We just started installing a project in Florida. You think of Florida, you think they have no water problems, right? But what's happening is often their water is not suitable for irrigation. And so they're draining down a lot of their freshwater sources in order to allow for crop development in an area where, you don't even think about water scarcity when you think of Florida. Another area, I was just in Nebraska last week, and we had a discussion about most of the farmers there are on groundwater. There are some surface water systems, specifically the Platte, and they're having issues with, in certain areas, right, they're having issues with their groundwater and their aquifers are being depleted. And in other areas, they're having energy problems. And so you've got farmers who now are spending copious amounts of energy in order to pump up from their aquifers. And so that's another area that's in crisis. The Colorado River, and I'll get to this more in the presentation, it had a really good year, which is both good and bad. Because it's good because we want more water in the system. 40 million people rely on it for irrigation as well as electricity. But then it delayed, like as I started the presentation, it delays the crisis for somebody else's problem, right? It's not something that's going away. Last year was an anomaly. Unless we have continuous years of anomalies, which is not what's going to happen, decision makers are going to have to do something to try to address this. Another area that is a very interesting focus is Texas. Texas has actually done really great at trying to conserve water, but what's happening is that they have had the worst drought these last 2 years in history. And so they're not getting even the minimal recharge that they're used to getting. And so the farmers there are just, they're already being very efficient, but they're out of water. Okay, so this is just one example looking at corn. But you could replicate this with soybeans, wheat, potatoes. And again, I guess focusing here on the breadbasket here. This is called the Ogallala Aquifer. I don't know if anyone has heard of this. Largest aquifer, and it's being depleted at a rapid basis. There's lawsuits between Nebraska and Kansas, between Oklahoma, and it's just because they're completely out of water. Okay, so what does this mean? I give presentations to a diverse audience. I really don't care what you call it. People have said, don't call it climate change, don't call it global warming. It honestly doesn't matter. All that matters is that we're going to have to figure out a way to grow what we need and more, because we're having anticipated population growth with less water. Even though if the status quo stayed exactly the same, farming practices stayed exactly the same, we would need an obscene amount of water, oceanic amount of water, to be able to grow food for the growing population here. So, okay, did I scare everyone? Are we ready for the happy part now? Sort of happy? Okay. So when we talk about our future, it's simple. 2 things that we need to do to try to come up with a solution for how we can manage our water better. This is a little cheeky, but the first one is just being more water efficient, right? Doing more with less. And then the second one, which is the focus of the book you guys have in your hands, is work smarter, not harder, right? We have existing water, whether it be aquifers, surface water systems like the Great Lakes. We just have to do a better job of making sure that we don't contaminate them so they become unusable. And so I'm just going to spend, I think, the rest of this just talking about how we can actually be part of the solution going forward. And I just want to, again, keep everything in mind. And this is why I decided to work for the company I work for, is because if you're going to make a difference and move the nozzle on water scarcity, you have to address the elephant in the room, which is that it's agriculture, 70% of our water. Okay, what does this look like? Flood. So I took this on a 127-degree day. I was in Yuma, Arizona, and it was like 9 in the morning. It wasn't even the middle of the day. I saw this. I went to school in Milwaukee. It's a water main break. That has to be that. And I got out of my truck and I looked, and I ended up seeing an irrigation pipe and this is how they irrigate in Yuma, Arizona. 125 degrees. I got out of my car. I thought I could poach an egg inside of that water. Like, you could just see the evaporative loss that was occurring. And so I thought, okay, there was a really bad farmer. There had to have been something going on. And by the way, these aren't even producing lemons yet. So this is just like when you are, and I'm sure some of you have gardens and things like that, the trees go through maturity levels, and so there are years where they're not producing anything, but yet they're irrigating like this. So, you know, the orange, the 80 liters, there are no oranges, or lemons in this case. But again, I'm like, okay, this is just an anomaly. There's no way people actually irrigate this way. Sandy soils, middle of the desert. Wrong. It's everywhere. So this is an almond, so this is an almond orchard in California. And again, it looks like you're in the swamp, but this is how they irrigate. In this circumstance, it was a little bit better because you have mature trees. They have a canopy, so it reduces the evaporative loss. But in Southern California, 115 degrees, you know that this isn't sustainable. So it's not just trees, because it's not an anomaly just by crops. So this is lettuce in Arizona. And so this black thing here is called a siphon. The water source here is a canal. In this circumstance, it's dirt lined, which means it's actually losing more water because there's no conveyance system, that it's actually concrete. And then what they do is there's laborers that come through their fields multiple times a week. They put these siphons in, which I've done and I almost fell on my butt, but it's like you dig it in there and then it just floods the field. And so you'll see these siphons going all along the field until you see the flood, the water in between. Rice. So everyone thinks of rice and you think of like the quintessential rice paddy, right? This is how we even grow rice here in the US. So this is called row rice as opposed to like in the different paddies. But similarly, they just run these pipes into in between the rows. And then it happens over and over and over again. And actually, what's interesting is that you actually have people who are not fighting us, but we now are partnering with people like Ducks Unlimited, because there's so much water that's used for this irrigation method. It actually gets migratory birds and similarly hunters that want to come in and do hunting in these. But again, we're wasting copious amounts of water for something that we could do better. Okay, so these are some shocking numbers. So again, I started thinking that this was just an anomaly in Arizona. People who are just a little bit backwards or just needed some help to becoming more efficient. Maybe they just don't know different technology. We're talking about 600 million acres around the world. And you're talking about not just in developing countries. When I first learned about the company that I worked for, I thought, that's not a US thing. There's no way we irrigate. I'm in Wisconsin. We've got pivots. 600 million acres. You've got 21 million in the US that are still using flood irrigation. And you remember that map I showed you of water stress? It's in the areas that are in red. And so when you're talking about cities like Phoenix, San Diego, Los Angeles that are continually struggling for water, there's obviously no growth in our development just because they're trying to scrape by. You think somebody would try to look at agriculture because that's how they're growing in those areas. And again, at first I thought, well, maybe the farmers just didn't know about technology or there isn't technology available for where these folks are. That's not true. So center pivot and drip irrigation were invented over 65 years ago. And yet, we're still, in the US, I'll be honest, there's a lot of center pivot, but to still have 21 million flood irrigated acres in the US, we have to find a way to do better. And so when you look at it, okay, why is it that farmers aren't trying to be more progressive? And I love farmers, by the way, I'm not railing on them, but these are the reasons why. So center pivot's incredibly expensive. There's a lot of federal programs that help the cost of the initial capital cost, but even then, it does require energy to still run the center pivot system. And specifically for drip irrigation, it's incredibly expensive. I'll show you a photo in a little bit, but it requires really, really clean water, like as if tap water. So it requires these really expensive filtration machines, which is why you often don't see drip irrigation except on things like wine grapes, avocados, sometimes on nuts, tree nuts, just something that has really good return. But when you're talking about corn growers, you're talking about alfalfa, so feed for dairy cows, they cannot, it just doesn't pencil out, or the math doesn't work out for them to actually invest in that kind of infrastructure and ongoing maintenance costs. And then this bottom one is because the majority of them weren't used to having issues with water. There's two different kinds of water law. There's riparian water law, and then there's Western water law, which is what's first in time, first in right. So a lot of these farmers have been there for 7 generations, and they have senior water rights. So they're like, we have the water. Why should we change? This is something that my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my other great-grandfather did. And so why do I feel like I need to change, especially when I have senior water rights? They don't look at it as a collective problem. They look at it as, it's not my problem. And so that was like the fundamental thing that I learned in speaking with farmers, who I have great respect for. But it was because they felt like, why is it that it's my responsibility to invest all of my hard-earned money to solve a problem for someone in Phoenix, someone in LA, who don't even understand us? And so speaking of Arizona or Phoenix, we were talking a little bit about, I feel like water does not get enough press in the newspaper, but the Colorado River was one that finally hit the presses, especially last year. 2022. So we're now 2024. So 2022, it was at the lowest levels since they filled it. To a point where, I mean, you look at this graph, and this is just looking from 2000. And again, just to reiterate, 40 million people rely on this river system, and we let it get to a point of total and complete despair. We had a very wet year, though, so that's very good. So I promised my husband I would put him in the presentation. So as you saw from my polar bear photo, I love to travel, but I always like water travel, so I can go and see something new. And so I convinced my husband to go to Las Vegas, but really the Hoover Dam. And so you can see here the iconic bathtub ring. And so remember I said 21 million flood irrigated acres in the US? 6 million are in the Colorado River Basin. And so I think after what happened and hitting that level from 1937, our government stepped up. And they actually allocated historic amounts of money. We're talking about $4.6 billion for the Bureau of Reclamation to try to actually do something about the problem. And I don't think this will surprise anybody. It certainly didn't surprise me. They haven't issued a single project yet. Not a single one. And I thought, well, this can't, and now I'm working for a corporation. We partner with all sorts of corporations. I thought, like, what the heck is going on? It's been 2 years. We have to have some answers. We've submitted applications. It's usually a grant program. They have so much money, they have no idea what to do with it. They're paranoid about, well, what if we make a mistake? What if we fund something that won't be successful? When in reality, the reason why this allocation happened was because they're throwing spaghetti at a wall, basically. They're trying to find as many solutions, creative, non-traditional, because the traditional ways of trying to solve this problem have not worked since 2000, right? And so they have to find new ways, engage in more business, NGOs, things like that, to come up with more creative solutions on how to actually solve the problem. But again, $4.6 billion. They have an annual conference every December in Las Vegas. It's called the Colorado River Water Users Association. And the Bureau of Reclamation comes up, and I thought for sure they were gonna here are like cornerstone projects. Here are 5 projects that we're gonna allocate money to. Nothing. And to also amplify the complexity of the Colorado River, so we're on the Great Lakes, and so we understand how an important body of water, you have to have states. In our circumstance, we also have another country. But we also have Indian tribes when we're talking about the Colorado River, and they also have senior water rights. We actually partner with a few of them. And so you're not only dealing with federal, state, local, NGOs, Indian tribes, which is like another country, more or less. Okay, so here's the good news. Well, one of the good news, I should say. So there have been solutions that have been trying to get at farmers, but we're approaching that in a different way. So since 2019, the company that I work for, and let me actually give you the background on the company. So Professor Uri Shani is the name of the gentleman. He's actually a former commissioner of water. He is actually credited to coming up with a solution for water management in the state of Israel, or in the country of Israel. World-renowned soil scientist, somebody that's just incredibly brilliant. And he looked at something like drip irrigation, which is a really efficient technology, right? It saves half the water. You're not flood irrigating like those photos that I showed you. And it's a way for farming to continue in areas that just don't have water availability. But it's a failure. He says it's a failure. And like, how can a technology that works perfectly be a failure? And it's a failure because it's only on 3% of irrigated acres globally. 3%. It was invented 65 years ago, so it's not like it's like still coming to market, right? It's something that's been around. There's now like 8 different companies that do it. And so he thought, well, it's a complete failure because it hasn't gotten the widespread adoption to actually move the needle on water stress and water efficiency. And so after he was finished being the commissioner of water, he went back. He's academic, like I said, soil scientist. He rethought what was wrong with drip irrigation. And in a slide previous, I talked about it's very expensive, it requires filters and things like that. And so what he came up with was a new kind of emitter that didn't require all of that infrastructure, because what he thought is that farmers didn't necessarily want to irrigate like that. I mean, it still costs them money. You're talking about half as much or double the amount of fertilizer that's required to fertigate, and the energy cost. If you're on groundwater, you're having to pump twice as much water. And so he rethought this, came up with this invention, entered the US in 2019, and we're now on tens of thousands of acres across the Colorado River Basin. As I mentioned, I was just in Nebraska. We're doing projects in Texas on rice, Arkansas, potatoes in Florida. And so it's a new kind of irrigation. So this is actually what it looks like zoomed in. So it's just a tube here, and I'll show you a slide, but this is the close-up here. Oop. So again, this is what it does. So it takes this flood field. So you remember this picture, the one that I thought was a water main break? So this exact infrastructure here, this field is maybe a block away. And so what we did was we took the same gravity that allows water to go across the field just when you flood, you flood and it just goes, uses that same energy just within drip lines. And so it drips just like you would a pressurized drip system, or I don't know if any of you have like irrigation systems at your house, it's the same thing. It just has a special emitter that doesn't require all of the infrastructure that goes into it. So this is the photo I was going to tell you about. So right here on the left, this is all the infrastructure that a farmer would need to run a pressurized drip system. So again, if I'm the farmer, I have senior water rights, I'm growing something like alfalfa, not wine grapes, that my margins are very small, why would I invest in all of this if I didn't have to? And so again, we didn't even stage this. Our tanks are now round, but this is all the infrastructure that's required. So there's a little bit of a drop off, so anybody that's in sciences, so there's a little bit, about 2 feet of head, and it provides enough power or pressure to propel the water across the field, just as if it were flood irrigated. And so again, just like pressurized drip, we're cutting half the amount of water that they're having to use, whether you're in Arizona, Florida, Nebraska. We're cutting fertilizer by half, which I was just mentioning at dinner with everything that's going on with Ukraine. Cost of fertilizer and inputs have gone crazy. Similarly, labor. So those siphons that I showed you, it takes a ton of labor to be able to do this. And so for our system, it's just a valve here. And so when I started working for the company, and it would have been right after 2020, so 2021, spring, right around this time, I started working with my still boss, who is the author of Troubled Water when I was a researcher, so we've now been together about 8 years. I joined NDRIP, he is our Chief Sustainability Officer, and so I joined him to try to amplify this technology to try to make a difference, because what I realized was that he could write another book, I could go work in policy and have $4.6 billion sit there and not be able to do anything with it, or I could join on the corporate side and try to make a difference in a different way. And so with the company, for the company I helped submit a series of grants. Our first one we had with USDA in partnership with the Colorado River Indian Tribes, $2.6 million. As part of that, we actually worked with an organization, amazing organization, some of my favorite people in the world. It's called Bonneville Environmental Foundation. Bonneville actually represents corporations like Amazon, Google, Meta or Facebook, PepsiCo, and countless others that you can think of in terms of, even, I think I said Amazon, Bitcoin people, all sorts of folks that use a lot of water in their supply chain. And they match them with projects that can save water. And so with their help for this project, the original project, I got another $1 million of match funds, which allowed us to get even more acres. And so basically my job is to just find the money and try to make relationships happen. And then we implement them into projects which actually save water. Speaking of partnerships, one of our biggest strategic partner is PepsiCo. So they own Lay's potato chips, Frito-Lay, which if you know anything about, I see your sweatshirt there in Iowa, you know anything about corn. A lot of corn producers actually contract directly with Frito. And so like many corporations, they have their 2030 goals, which if you would have rewound, let's just say 15 years ago, they thought they were going to achieve those goals by using recycled water in their warehouses, right, to mop the floors. And then they realized, okay, we did all these low-hanging fruits, and we're nowhere near what we need to do because of our water footprint. And so they started going down their supply chain all the way down to potato growers, corn growers, and actually working with them to try to get them to convert to our system in particular. And so with that, they provided financial support. So again, going back to the farmer, if I have senior water rights, and this is the way I've grown for generations, if you want me to do something to be a good citizen, okay, but you're gonna make me pay for it too? And so again, with my partnership with them, or our partnership with them, we've been able to try to find funds to try to offset that cost. So they're, we're grateful that they're willing to even change their practice, but certainly not for also taking the financial risk. Another example of a partnership, this is a government entity that actually is amazing and actually implements money. So we were awarded a grant that is working with the upper Colorado River Basin states. So there's the upper basin and lower basin. And so we're talking about doing projects in places like Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, to try to get at the upper basin states as well. And so we're going to be doing a series of pilots. I did not talk about this in this presentation, but when you talk about somewhere like Utah, I originally just thought of it as because it's an upper basin state, and so I thought, ooh, another Colorado River state that I could try to go after because it comes with all of the water scarcity reasons that I've shared. The Great Salt Lake is in trouble. And I don't know if and again, this is another story that hasn't been covered in the news. Ironically, I think my boss may write a book about this next. He took a trip there, would have been right when I was on my honeymoon, so in January. And he got out, they took one of those fancy airboats. He could get out and stand, and the water was up to his knees. And it used to be 25 feet. And so I don't know if you've also heard of the Aral Sea and all of the toxicity that is coming from that. Salt Lake City and Salt Lake, the Great Salt Lake, is trending towards there. But that's another state that the government leadership is out of this world. They recognize that Great Salt Lake, without Great Salt Lake, there is no Salt Lake City. And so they're actually taking the appropriate urgency to try to actually come up with more solutions and trying to work with producers, again, with the senior water rights to try to get them to be a little bit more efficient. Okay. These are just results from the field. So every field that we go into, it's not just you get to take, I'm a nice girl, you get to take my word for it. Every system has a flow meter on it. And so what we're able to do is actually measure how much water is being applied, comparing it to like when we were first starting in our pilots, we would have what's called a control field. So we would use a field that was adjacent to show the difference in water. Instead of doing that now, what we do is we take a historical documentation of what a farmer would use in the past on the same field. And so you'll see here, that's what this one was as well. But you can see 50% water savings, so the top row, 50% water savings here, 42% here. Again, this is consistent. You can see the acre foot is here, 1.6 here. And this is corn, soybean, corn rotation, which is very, the other thing that we always have to keep in mind is that we don't want to tell the grower what to do. And so we have to work within the constraints of what he does. So does he till? Does he not till? Is he willing to try something like strip tilling, which will allow us to have 3 consecutive years on our system that we don't have to do a ton of maintenance on? And so this is an example of that, where we worked within what the grower did. You'll see a bump in yield. I don't think I touched on this. When you flood irrigate, I think it's kind of intuitive. When you're flooding, you're stressing that plant. It's no different than in your garden when you're trying to water your tomatoes. If you get the leaves wet or you water too much, you're stressing the root zones. When you're using drip irrigation, you're giving the exact right amount of water exactly when it needs it. And so you're not stressing the plant. And so you'll see a bump in yield for that. In addition, because depending on how the field is laid out, we talk about something called uniformity. When I talk about uniformity, I'm talking about how consistent is the crop from here all the way here. Andy Jobman is the farmer here, actually David, his brother, but they call this the long field because he's used to not getting water. It's so long. He's not used to getting the flood water, which comes from over here. There's a hydrant here. And it used to flood all the way down. But this whole 20%, he would only get about 70% uniformity on this field. With our system, he's able to achieve close to, I think it was like 93% uniformity. So we're able to reach further than if we were just dealing with a typical flood irrigated field. So more acreage getting irrigated, more yield. And so in those 2 ways, you'll see bumps in yield. 24%, 18%, and again, a decent amount here too. And then why I was in Nebraska last weekend is the energy. So as I mentioned, Nebraska is kind of a funny state where there's some of it that's a little bit more drought constraint than the rest of it. They all care about energy because energy is so expensive right now. And so when you're seeing these numbers, 46%, 43%, they see money in their pockets. And so the energy alone, they were willing to give the system a try. Not only, we're working with a couple of, like PepsiCo, for example, helped sponsor some of these fields. But I also worked one-on-one with the farmers to take advantage of what's called the Rural Energy for America program. It's a federal program that actually helps support producers to install more efficient irrigation, or if they wanted to put something like a renewable energy system, like a solar panel on their pivot or something like that. Just as Bureau of Reclamation has historic amounts of money, so does USDA. And so they actually even increased what's called a cost share, where the farmer used to have to pay 70% of the total project cost. They knocked that down to 50%. So now we're talking about the growers only are responsible for 50%, and even then I try to find even more money to offset that 50% that the grower is trying to do. So carbon emissions. This is something that is on every corporation's mind. They know they have to do better in a variety of ways. And so this is, again, a PepsiCo example looking at potatoes. They're using what's called the Cool Farm tool, so Cool, C-O-O-L. And what they do is they put in all the inputs of their field. Actually, the farmers do it, which they really hate because they have to go on their smartphones and enter all of this data. And so what it does is it actually measures carbon emissions from production. So what generates carbon from farming? I'm sorry if it's getting wonky, but energy, right? So they're required a lot of energy to actually make the system go or pump the water. And then fertilizer. Fertilizer is one of the most carbon-intensive inputs that a farmer has. And so because our system cuts both fertilizer and energy by half, because we're pumping half as much, we often will reduce carbon emissions by 83% compared to flood irrigation. And what's even more remarkable, the rice photo that I showed you, rice is even worse. And so we're talking about, that's actually the majority of flood irrigation around the world is rice. If we can fix rice, we can fix a lot of things. But rice is actually 12% of global agricultural methane emissions. 12%. And when you're talking about methane, it's 10 times worse than the carbon equivalent. And so by being able to reduce methane emissions, research says 78%. We actually are just finishing up our first trials measuring methane. But I mean, talk about moving the needle and looking at it from a perspective of a holistic, where we're not just looking at water, we're also looking at energy and carbon. Okay, so that's the more efficient side of it. So what's the second thing we can do is protecting existing water supplies. Okay, I know this is probably a topic of conversation here also, because I know that and I have a slide at the end about this, about farms and water quality. And so when you look at what we have in terms of water resources, we have to do a better job of finding ways to work with what's called non-point source pollution, right? It's agriculture. Since I was an undergrad, we really didn't have a good situation for it, because often it requires one-on-one with an individual producer to try to get them to, I guess, manage their soil, manage their nutrients better so it doesn't end up contaminating. And so, and then like I mentioned, nutrient management's the key to this. These are just a couple of examples of what producers can be doing. I know I already mentioned the strip tilling. So when you're talking about nutrient management, it's this idea of not disrupting the soil. So when people would till all the time, you're eventually going to remove those nitrates, nitrites, or pathogens, things like that, and it ends up leaching down into your groundwater. It ends up running off into your nearby streams, unless you do things like buffers. But the area that I care the most about is this: nutrient management tools. Less than 15% of growers use any kind of technology to decide how much fertilizer they're actually going to be applying. They'd use things like, how does the plant look? How does the soil feel? What's Joe Schmo down the street going to do? That's how they decide whether or not to irrigate and whether or not to fertigate. And so this is just a picture of the sensor. So I talked about the irrigation side of NDRIP. This is the sensor side. So this is our sensor. This is how it looks above ground. But what it is it's buried underneath, and it actually gives the farmer information just like this on his phone, and it shows things like a recommendation, when to irrigate, how much to irrigate, how's your nutrient management. This is looking at nitrogen. So it tells you how much is in the plant, is there some in the soil, and then how inefficient have you been. And then we also put a map on here with weather data. And so when you look at this, you have a farmer who now has information where he can more efficiently manage his nutrient management on his field. And I think just based off of conversation, this isn't my expertise at all, but based off of conversations with researchers that are actually doing this work in universities and partnering, they think this is going to be, just in the next 5 years, it's going to transform our nutrient management and unfortunately starting to go after these AOCs or areas of concern where we've already contaminated. Oh, man, time. Okay. So just to go a little bit further, it's not just about managing the quality of water so we make sure that we have the appropriate quantities to continue to produce the food that we need, right? It's also because we're using contaminated water to grow our food. And in particular, that rice field, which also is the 12% of agricultural methane, It's also a source of arsenic. So when there's a farmer in Arkansas that's flood irrigating his rice, he's flood irrigating on a field that used to be used for cotton back in the day and has all of these legacy significant heavy metals like arsenic. And so when you're flood irrigating the way that you are, it actually goes into the plant. And so when you're using something like a brown rice, a whole grain, so not white rice where it's like goes through a refining process, you actually end up with arsenic. It's something that often isn't talked about, but I know that researchers at University of Arkansas and Texas A&M are seriously looking at it, because when you think of like baby food, rice baby food, or Kellogg, big companies like Kellogg's, they have to do something about it. And then the other thing that's hitting the news a lot is our lettuce. And so I know that they've had tons of recalls when it's looking at romaine, seems to be the one that everyone picks on. And all of these new juicing diets are people like digesting tons and tons of these leafy greens, and it's getting all of that bacteria in there. And so E. coli and salmonella are also things that we have to pay attention to. And why is that? And again, I think this goes without saying, it's that often your water source is used for more than one thing. So it's your irrigation. It then goes and becomes wastewater, and in a lot of circumstances, that becomes your drinking water too. So not just your food, but also your drinking water. Okay, another good example, cryptosporidium in '93, my mom actually got it, was an example of poor water management and a variety of other things, but I don't know, everyone here has to remember crypto, people dying, and yes, okay. There were there's theories of what caused it, but what ended up happening was change. So we saw it with Flint, Michigan. It was like people needed to become really sick, become a big story, and then progress happened. But right after these sorts of things happen, we lower our confidence in our government officials to be able to protect us, right? And not just that, this is the number that also is worthwhile looking at. So in the case of cryptosporidium, you have a public utility that's actually in charge of making sure that the water's safe. They have these regulations. They have to make sure the water meets those quality tests. If you're on a well, anybody here, well water? Me? Yeah. Have you had a municipality come out and test your water? Sometimes? Yeah? Okay, I do. You don't have to. Unless you're selling a house, depending on your loan, they're not saying this is the standard that you have to have. You have to have testing every 6 months, every 3 months, things like that. And so you've got 13 million people who often are in rural areas, surrounded by agriculture, that I know my uncle, for example, he hasn't tested as well. I showed up with a kit a couple of times, but, and so there's no knowledge of what's actually in here. The other thing I wanted to mention is that even in circumstances where you have the big utility, like we did here in Milwaukee, there's a lot of, and this is a chart that you'll see once you read Troubled Water. This looks at the water utilities in the US. And so you can see the size in terms of population. And you see how many total are 500 households or less. So you got 28,595 utilities that are serving less than 500 people. Often, when they're small, they have less of a rate base, right? And so for them to hit the standards that somewhere like Milwaukee or Los Angeles could hit, they would need a heck of a lot more money to be able to do that than the rate base that they get for their 500 households. So what the EPA does, instead of fining them, or I should say granting them money to improve their systems, they give them an exemption, meaning they don't have to hit those standards, or they have 10 years to get to those standards or to hit those goals. And so when you're looking at it from a perspective of, again, these are usually rural communities, and they're getting literally less quality of water than you would here. Not to mention the level of inefficiency to have over 51,000 utilities, water utilities in the US, is just, I mean, it speaks for itself in terms of how inefficient it is. So that brings me to this book. I'm almost actually out of time. I could do a whole lecture on this, but instead I just gave you guys free copies so you can read it. But it tells the story of American drinking water and basically picks up the story from where I left off. It goes into things like forever chemicals, so like PFOA, PFOS has been in there. Things like perchlorate. I don't know if anybody is military, but it's a firefighting foam that's used on military bases, and there's lots of legacy chemicals. But it basically walks through a variety of contamination. We talk about bottled water in this because often people ask me the first question, where do you get your drinking water from? And like everyone thinks that bottled water is a safer option, but often it's just bottled from the utility, right? And so they put it in packaging, they sell it to you for 99 cents a piece. It's tap water in a plastic bottle that you then have to go recycle. And so I think it's a really interesting, I'm biased because I was his researcher on this book, but I think it does a really nice job. And again, not just talking about the problems, but also giving solutions at the end of how can we do better, whether it be consolidating the amount of utilities or just trying to, I guess, have EPA move and be more aggressive on standards. Or instead of having standards from 1986, maybe we should be re-looking at new chemicals that could be introduced into our systems. As you can see from this presentation, I love maps because it can speak so much louder than words. Does anyone know where this is? Central Sands. Central Sands, yeah. Yes. I'm also not an expert in the Central Sands. However, I have talked to the Potato Growers Association numerous times. I wish NDRIP was a good technology for there. I don't think it is, just because we have a lot of rolling hills and we need like a flat field. But it's interesting because this is a map from, the year was 2021 maybe? There's more. 2012, okay. Over 3,000 high capacity wells here on this map. And I can send the other version from the report that I read on this. Just the change from 1950 to today is astronomical. There were hundreds in 1950. You're talking about like 300, and now we're at 3,000. And so when you look at these water scarcity maps, yeah, we're right next to Lake Michigan, but when you, again, pull those two levers, when you're talking about less water, less precipitation, and then this, where you're digging a heck of a lot deeper and going into the aquifer and depleting it at a rate that recharge isn't happening. I think the report called it missing water. They don't know what happened. And you can see right on the map, that's exactly what happened. Trying to think if there was anything else. This was my last slide, so I'll take questions.
You were talking about PFAs being used in the military. It's not just the military. I was on the fire department in Columbus, Ohio, and they used it at the airport, put out major airplane fires.
Right, exactly. Yep.
Well, putting on your big thinking cap here, and again, thanks. It's so nice to see my work and somebody's using it.
Did you write that?
Yeah, that's my stuff.
Is it really?
Yeah.
What's your last name?
Kraft.
It's Kraft. I was about to say. Oh, it's great to meet you. I do read your stuff.
Nice to meet you too.
I have a bunch on my computer actually, so thank you.
You
should be giving this.
Point being, and now I'm blushing. You see what you did. So we have this situation of Central Sands that in dry years we're irrigating so much, we're drying up lakes and streams. We just gone through a 10-year record rainfall period, and so things diminish. But my county next door, 1 in 4 wells exceeds the nitrate standard. 3-4 municipal systems have to treat. I forget what the statistics are for Waupaca County. Yeah. But I've come to this conclusion as a research and outreach hydrologist. The agricultural system is screwed up, and we have to fix it. We would not invent this thing from scratch. So if you look at our paths paralleled each other in California and in the Southwest. I had similar water tours.
Okay.
But what did you see, during these dry periods here where they go, gosh, these farmers are running out of water. Their response is, we need more water. It's like, there's no more water,
Yeah.
But yet, we're not going to starve. we don't have to put corn in our cars and burn it for fuel. That never made any sense. We could find ways to grow truck crops and things like that as some kind of swath through the Midwest. That alfalfa in the Colorado River Basin, let's replace some corn with it here. And we have to think about how to remake this industry here. And it's powerful politically, powerful with public relations, and so I'm saying, you could, on your way home tonight, you could think, how are we going to make this change? I guess, I'm sorry, that was more of a commentary than a question, but I think that we got a messed up system. We don't have a clue how to write it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, first of all. You could have given this presentation, but when you look at it, I think it starts from your kind of work and educating, getting in the room with people that can actually make the difference. Because what happens is you have a lot of elected officials, maybe not in places like Arizona where water's everywhere, but based off of our conversations throughout the US, there's a lot of elected officials that don't know any water science beyond high school. And so this idea of educating, I think, these policymakers, because I think what they look for is the magic wand solution, things like desalination. That's the big word right now. And so they're thinking that they're going to create a desal plant that's going to somehow subsidize Arizona, and the water is going to end up costing like $6,000 an acre foot. Who can afford to do that, right? And not just that, it's like that's a solution that's going to take you 15 years to actually implement if you ever get there, and the amount of cost that goes into it. The other one that I still can't believe I hear, because a lot of meetings I go into, they don't know I'm from Wisconsin. They talk about literally piping from the Great Lakes. And they've been doing that since 1910. It's been forever that they've thought of doing this, yet that just shows they don't know anything about how water is governed in any other state. The Mississippi is another one that I just laugh at, because the Mississippi itself is having a drought, and so they can't even ship cargo ships down the system, but yet they're going to try to pipe from the Mississippi to try to overcome that. And so I think that it stems from educating. My boss gives me all different hats to wear. A lot of it's like being an evangelist. Like, you just have to tell the message that you need to understand. And if I had like one take-home point, my brother always says for presentations, one take-home point, just remember 70% of our water is for agriculture. That in itself will start moving your other people's brains of, okay, clearly we need to start addressing this sort of situation. But I guess from that perspective, I will use the car ride home to see how I can help here too. That's the biggest thing with a lot of my work. It's not in Wisconsin. And so one of the things I want to do in the next maybe 25 years is to start going after problems that are affecting us too. But thank you for your work.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
You talked about getting the water out into the field. How does it physically get out there with your new system? You said you don't do pipes, and how do you deliver the water?
Yes, so is there a way to turn the projector back on real quick? So you remember the photo where it showed you the siphons, how it would take the water from the canal and just flood the field, or like a fire hydrant, they'll let the water go. On our system, let's see if it comes up. There are pipes. So what it is, and I should have brought some samples, it's just like a tube, more or less, like a plastic. Correct. It's what's called a drip line or a lateral. And so the water goes from the system through these laterals and then uses the gravity to continue on to the end of the field. It's exactly like that, exactly. It's a little bit thicker in terms of width. It's like 22 or 44 millimeters. And it's like a compassible, let's see, I can show you. Let me show this picture. Right here. So this is what it looks like. The black right here. This goes up and down the field, just like this. Yeah, so it runs, depending on the crop and the spacing, it'll go between X amount between the spacing and the crops. But because of the way that this strip line is made, it's actually fully recyclable too. So what happens is through seasons, depending on the grower's practice, we'll actually take the tape, recycle it to make more tape. And so it's like, versus a pressurized drip system has 2 kinds of plastic inside. I could go into that, but it's not allowed to be recyclable, so it ends up in landfills. So instead, we just pull it from the field and then recycle it and then redeploy.
So where does the water come from? I mean, you still have to pull water away from its natural source.
Correct, yes. So in this this is what irrigation looks like in Colorado River, parts of Nebraska, New Mexico. So you have these series of canals that convey water, like from the Colorado River. It goes through canals, which is basically a concrete-lined river, right? And then growers will pull water directly from here through siphons to then pull the water through. Our system connects that same way. So there's a little pipe here that pulls the water directly from the canal. Now, if they're on groundwater, they'll pull directly from the well. So that's why there's still some energy, because you still have to get the water to the field.
So they're still taking the water out of its natural source. They are using less.
Correct.
But it still is not necessarily rechargeable.
So return flow and rechargeable is 2 different things, but not necessarily. So like the thing that gets me is that when you're in the Colorado River and we have conversations with Bureau of Reclamation and USDA, they look at this as a potential for groundwater recharge for the Colorado River in 125 degrees. And so it's like we bang our heads against the wall saying, you've got to be joking. And the level of infiltration is so small that, again, it's all the evaporative loss. And so we measure things like ET, evapotranspiration, to try to prove, which seems counterintuitive, that we have to actually prove this. But that's what they look at for recharge, which is nonsense.
It seems, I don't know, am I on? Okay, it seems to me that there are 2, institutions, I guess, that could be very productive in working toward change here. And one of them is the agricultural universities, and one of them is our legislatures in the states. And so I'm wondering what what your organization does that influences the ag universities and that influences our legislatures.
Yeah, that's a great question. So every new state that we go into, my first order of business is be friends with the ag extensionist. So when you're talking about areas like Texas, Arizona, Wisconsin, wherever, any kind of ag university focus, they are the most influential to the growers, because that's who they go to when they're wanting to learn about a new seed, a new fertilizer, or a new irrigation technology. So that's the first thing I do. And then the second thing is I try to go to them not saying, please introduce me to these growers, let's push our system. I always like to bring something to the table. So typically I'll have a grant where I'll say, hey, I would love for you to do independent research on whatever the heck you want to do, but could you possibly use our system as part of it? Completely do whatever results that you see on the field, so it's not like we're buying research, which you can do in some circumstances, where we partner with the university to allow them to publish their work based off of our system, which then can be used. And it's beneficial for us because we actually see some of the challenges that the growers would be facing. And so we can help address that by working or tweaking our system, looking at things like a big deal in the Colorado River is salt management. And so being able to work with different salinities in the soil help us be a better partner to the producer and to make sure that our system is working. The second thing we do for the state governments, we go and have meetings and we teach them. So we use words like reports like Mr. Kraft writes, and we take it in and say, here, did you know about this? And this is what we can do to solve it. And we always go in with an ask. So I'll use an example from the University of Arizona. We befriended the university extension, just like I said, but we also went to the state legislature at the same time and said, hey, the extension is doing this amazing work with outreach to farmers to try to help them become more efficient. You need to allocate money to allow them to purchase the equipment to implement it onto their fields. And so it took about a year, but they allocated $30 million. Growers could apply for up to $1,500 per acre, up to $1 million. So there was 30 allocation. It was out within 6 months. They allocated another 15 million, 6 months. And now they are right in session right now. And so they're looking at two bills. One is 50 million, one is 30 million. And so we do things like trying to have letters of support for the bill, going in and talking to what we call champions. So the real leaders in the space who maybe are in a district that there's a lot of flood irrigation or farmers that are really struggling with water availability. And we try to amplify them as our evangelists to go in and try to fight for that funds to go to the system or the programs that allow that to happen. So it's dual, but you hit it right on. Those are the two big things, right? That we have to find a way to, in every state we go into, those are the two parties that we go to. In addition to NGOs like Farm Bureau is another big one. The dairymen as well, just because of the amount of alfalfa that's being grown. I didn't talk about this, but the other thing that's infuriating about the amount of alfalfa that's grown in the Colorado River, a lot of it gets shipped. So you talk about virtual water, like what I showed you in terms of the cheese and the pizza and the steak. We're growing alfalfa and then shipping it overseas. And so with the alfalfa also goes our water.
There's an arc on TV the other night.
Oh, was there? Okay, yeah.
Two questions. Related to the education part, I have a lot more faith in our children than I do in the public policy area of adults. What are you doing for educating our youth and supporting them, because they will indeed be the change makers I think that we need? The second question is Waukesha and its draw on the Great Lakes.
Yeah.
That's an incredible step. Are there other communities that are thinking, and what is the long-term impact of that kind of disaster happening to our Great Lakes?
So both great questions. I can speak personally to the education of young people, and I'll preface this by, if you know any young people that are interested in sustainability, water, we get to partner with really cool organizations like Google, Amazon, like I said, PepsiCo. If you would have asked me 15 years ago that I would be doing this, there'd be no way. There'd be no way this is happening. But we really are looking for that generation to step up because they get it. They're already, I think at dinner we were talking about thrifting. They're already using recycled jeans, right? They're educating me in a lot of circumstances. And so I know that we do things like one-on-one mentoring. I know I do, especially women in the space. And so one-on-one mentoring, things like giving just these sorts of talks at university, so actually going in and trying to be as entertaining as possible to get them interested in it. The other thing is meeting them where they are, so things like YouTube. They've been doing series and working with like animation videos and stuff like that to try to make it a little easier than handing them a 300-page book. From that perspective, I do know that my colleagues that are working for places like DNR or water utilities, government officials, they're bringing on more and more interns into the space to try to get them prepared for taking over their jobs as moving forward. Waukesha diversion. My teacher in school actually worked on that originally in the evaluations. To be honest, I don't know. I don't know how. The idea of them piping from the Great Lakes down to Arizona is never going to happen for a lot of reasons, but I think that the compact is strong enough to hold up to that sort of thing. I'm not an expert on Great Lakes, but I think I read that our water levels are up this year or last year, so that's good news. We have a whole bunch of other issues with the Great Lakes that I think we need to also be taking care of, things like erosion. Water quality issues, again, I think that should be also at the forefront. But when I have conversations about we're just going to pipe from the Great Lakes, it's just nonsense. So at least from my perspective. There was one last slide I had, which I'm glad I didn't get any questions about this, which I thought for sure I would, but I was prepared. Could we turn the projector on just one more time? Sorry. And then make sure you all get a book before you leave. If for some reason we run out, let me know. I have my card. You can write me and I'll mail them to you guys. Yep. Okay, so no one asked any questions about this, which is a good thing because I'm not an expert at all. I know. So I've been reading, thanks to Winchester Academy, I was briefed a little bit about what's been going on. So I ended up reaching out to a couple of professors at UW-Madison that are experts on these sorts of facilities. Only to learn there is a town hall meeting on Thursday. Is this next Wednesday? Yes?
This is Vanguard's own meeting.
Okay. So I didn't know how many people knew about this, so that's why I just wanted to make sure that everyone had the information. The folks at UW-Madison just sent this to me, and so I just wanted to make sure everyone knew. But if there's also a town hall, you said Wednesday as well? The public hearing is Wednesday. This is just a meeting for education from Vanguard, who brought the university in.
Can you tell us something about, I don't know what Winchester does and what, that's all about.
So I put his contact information. He is the expert here. And so feel free, I can give these slides to Tracy or whoever. I would contact him when you're talking about this sort of, because it's a complicated issue, and I don't know enough about it to say anything about it. I only know like water quality issues, and so from that perspective. So again, I'll defer to the experts on this, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew about it just because, yes.
I just wanted to mention it's at the one on Wednesday, the
Yes.
following week, the 28th, is at the high school at 5 o'clock
Okay, so did everyone hear that?
at the auditorium.
So next week, Wednesday, the actual town hall is on.
And it is
Yeah.
a hearing, so the public can speak for 3 minutes on your opinion. And there is also, you can submit letters to the township supervisors by the 27th.
Great. Thank you.
And are you able to talk at all about water quality as discharge comes off at 104 degrees from something like that and comes out at 41,000, gallons a day potentially into an unnamed tributary?
So this is what I've heard, and I know that each of them are separate based off of the specific location, where the discharge goes, and the permitting, I imagine. But again, I don't want to speak to something that I don't know. I do know that any kind of agricultural operation that I think the size that this is definitely cause for concern. If I lived here, I can give you that opinion. I would definitely want to look at like an environmental assessment. I don't know if it's even a possibility. But looking at the environmental issues, I would definitely want more information on that, unless the township already did this. Okay. So that would be if I lived here, that would be my first step. I do know that digesters and the folks at Madison will talk about that they have benefits, and that's what I heard from them. But they are only looking at it from the perspective of what they do. They're not looking at it from like, we talked about this at dinner too, the traffic that it brings, things like that. I don't know the specifics on this location, but those are the kinds of questions I would want to have answered if I lived here.
One sentence, what does a digester do?
So it digests the manure. Yeah.
But it
So-
also brings in food waste.
It's a co-digester?
This is a coal digester.
Okay, so this is what she didn't tell me, because I asked her. I said, so what else is going in here? Is it just used for the cow or the manure that would be, okay.
Food waste is coming in from 100 miles around radius.
So this is also the traffic question that I have, is where are things coming from?
Loads a day.
Yeah. Yeah. So there was a similar situation that was going on in Trenton that's been covered a little bit. And the community started like an NGO group that actually demanded to have a full assessment done. And from what I understand, they were successful at getting the assessment. So maybe that's a model to look at, the city of Trenton. Wisconsin.
Yep,
Yeah.
down by West Bend, if you're interested. So thank you so much,
Well,
Katie.
thank you.
We're at our time. So thank you, everybody, for coming.